The driveway leading to the mansion was long and winding, flanked by ancient oaks that twisted their branches like arthritic fingers reaching for the sky. Sarah watched them blur past as Mark steered the car through the late afternoon haze, her excitement mingling with a strange sense of foreboding. The mansion came into view slowly, emerging from the mist like a relic from another time. Its tall gothic spires loomed against the darkening sky, casting long shadows over the grounds. It was beautiful in a way, but there was something about it that made Sarah's skin prickle. "Isn't it magnificent?" Mark asked, a smile breaking across his face. He was proud of this place, the ancestral home that had been in his family for generations. Sarah forced a smile and nodded, though she couldn't quite shake the unease that had settled in the pit of her stomach. As they pulled up in front of the mansion, the massive oak doors creaked open, and a slender figure stepped out. Evelyn, Mark's mother. She stood at the top of the stairs, her posture straight and rigid, her expression unreadable. Even from a distance, Sarah could feel the weight of the woman's gaze. Evelyn was beautiful in a cold, austere way, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. Mark jumped out of the car, hurrying around to open Sarah's door. As Sarah stepped out, Evelyn's gaze fixed on her, and a flicker of something unreadable passed over her face. Was it disapproval? Or something else entirely? "Welcome to your new home," Evelyn said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. Sarah forced another smile and extended her hand, but Evelyn hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. "Thank you, Evelyn," Sarah replied. "The house is even more beautiful than I imagined." Evelyn's lips twitched into a semblance of a smile, but her eyes remained cold. "I hope you find it comfortable." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she simply nodded, her hand slipping away from Evelyn's icy grasp. Mark wrapped an arm around Sarah's shoulders and led her up the stairs into the grand foyer of the mansion. The heavy wooden doors shut behind them with a dull thud that echoed through the vast space. Inside, the mansion was every bit as imposing as it was outside. The ceilings soared high above, with intricate chandeliers casting a dim, golden light over the polished marble floors. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following Sarah as she walked by. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something that smelled faintly of decay. As they walked further into the house, Sarah caught sight of a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. She paused to study her reflection, but the image that stared back at her seemed almost unfamiliar, her face pale against the shadows that lurked in the corners of the room. "You must be exhausted after the journey," Evelyn said, breaking the silence. "I've prepared the guest room for you." "Guest room?" Mark frowned, glancing at his mother. "I thought we'd stay in the master bedroom." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. "The master bedroom is under renovation," she said. "It wouldn't be suitable for you at the moment." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but something in Evelyn's tone made her stop. There was no point arguing, not on her first day here. She exchanged a glance with Mark, who simply shrugged, then followed Evelyn up the grand staircase. The guest room was at the end of a long, narrow hallway, its door slightly ajar as if inviting them in. Evelyn pushed it open with a creak, revealing a room that was smaller and less opulent than the rest of the house, but still richly furnished. "I'll leave you to settle in," Evelyn said, her voice as smooth as ever. "Dinner will be ready in an hour." As Evelyn turned to leave, Sarah caught a glimpse of something in the hallway, a shadow, quick and fleeting, darting just beyond the reach of the firelight. She blinked, and it was gone. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mark frowned. "What was what?" "That shadow. Did you see it?" Mark glanced down the hallway, his brow furrowed. "It's probably just the light playing tricks on you. These old houses can be a bit eerie at first, but you'll get used to it." Sarah wanted to believe him, but the unease in her gut only deepened. She watched as Mark unpacked their bags, his movements casual and unconcerned, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But for Sarah, everything about this place felt wrong. After they had unpacked, Sarah wandered around the room, running her fingers over the intricate carvings on the furniture. She stopped at the window, gazing out at the darkening landscape. The forest that surrounded the mansion seemed to stretch on forever, a dense, impenetrable wall of black trees. There was no sign of civilization, no lights from nearby houses, just endless darkness. A chill ran down her spine, and she quickly pulled the curtains shut, shutting out the night. When she turned around, Mark was watching her with a puzzled expression. "Are you okay?" he asked. Sarah forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." Mark walked over and pulled her into a hug, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're going to love it here, I promise. Once we've settled in, it'll feel like home." But as Sarah rested her head against his chest, all she could think about was that fleeting shadow in the hallway and the coldness in Evelyn's eyes. She wanted to believe Mark, but a nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered that this place would never be her home. And that was when she heard it again. The faintest rustling sound, like a whisper in the dark, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. The days at the mansion seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one more unsettling than the last. Sarah tried to acclimate to her new life, but the mansion refused to let her find comfort. There was an omnipresent tension in the air, a feeling that something terrible lurked just beyond her reach. It wasn't long before the quiet dread she had felt upon first arriving began to grow into something much darker and more oppressive. Mark had returned to his work at the family's law firm in town, leaving Sarah alone with Evelyn for long hours. The mansion, once merely intimidating, now felt actively hostile. The servants moved about silently, their faces downcast, as if they were as much a part of the house as its dark wood and cold stone. Sarah often caught them exchanging uneasy glances when they thought she wasn't looking, but any attempt to engage them in conversation was met with monosyllabic responses or polite but firm refusals. The east wing of the mansion had become an obsession for Sarah. It was the only part of the house that seemed off limits, the door at the end of the corridor always locked. No one ever ventured there, and any questions about it were met with tight-lipped silence. Evelyn had gone so far as to warn Sarah to stay away from that part of the house, her tone laced with a subtle threat that sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Some things are better left undisturbed," Evelyn had said one evening over dinner, her eyes never leaving Sarah's as she delicately sliced through her roast. "Curiosity can be dangerous, my dear." Sarah had nodded politely, but her mind had already been made up. She needed to know what was hidden in the East Wing. The locked door became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the mansion, a tangible barrier between her and the truth that lay buried in this house's dark history. One evening, after Evelyn had retired early, claiming a headache, Sarah found herself standing before the door to the east wing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached out to touch the cold brass handle. It didn't budge, as expected, but she had come prepared. Slipping a hairpin from her pocket, she began to pick the lock, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. After what felt like an eternity, there was a faint click, and the door creaked open, revealing a darkened hallway beyond. Sarah hesitated for a moment, the darkness seeming to beckon her forward, but she steeled herself and stepped inside. The air in the east wing was different, stale and heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. The carpet beneath her feet was threadbare, and the faint scent of decay lingered in the air. It was as if this part of the house had been forgotten, left to wither and rot in its isolation. Sarah moved cautiously down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the oppressive silence. At the end of the corridor, she found another door, this one slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she stepped into what appeared to be a study, dimly lit by a single dust-covered lamp on an old mahogany desk. The room was cluttered with books, papers, and strange artifacts, objects that seemed out of place in a modern home. A large ornate mirror hung on the wall, its surface tarnished and cracked. As Sarah moved closer to the desk, she noticed an old, leather-bound journal lying open, the pages yellowed with age. She picked it up, her fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The handwriting was neat, almost too precise, and the entries detailed the life of one of Mark's ancestors, Margaret Blackwood, a woman who had lived in the mansion over a century ago. The entries started innocuously enough, with descriptions of daily life, but as Sarah read on, the tone grew darker, more desperate. Margaret wrote of her growing fear of the house, of the whispers she heard in the night, and the strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. She spoke of her husband's increasing obsession with the mansion, of the rituals he performed in secret, and of the otherworldly presence that seemed to inhabit the East Wing. One entry in particular sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. August 23rd, 1894. They came again last night. I heard them moving in the walls, their whispers growing louder with each passing day. Edward says I'm imagining things, but I know what I've seen. The house is alive with their presence, and they will not rest until they have claimed us all. The ritual, it must be completed, or they will take him too. I fear I am losing my mind, but I must do what I can to protect us. God help me. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages, each entry revealing more of Margaret's descent into madness. Or perhaps it was something else, something far more sinister than madness. The last few pages were stained with what looked like blood, the words barely legible through the dark splotches. The final entry was dated a week before Margaret's death, and it was nothing more than a single, chilling line. The house demands a sacrifice. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she closed the journal, the weight of its revelations settling heavily on her. The room seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing longer, darker. She backed away from the desk, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just read. What had Mark's family been involved in? And what role did Evelyn play in all of this? As she turned to leave the room, something caught her eye. A small, intricately carved box on a shelf above the desk. It was locked, but the key was nearby, hidden under a stack of old papers. With trembling hands, Sarah unlocked the box and opened it, revealing a collection of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were addressed to Margaret, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. As she began to read, Sarah's blood ran cold. The letters spoke of dark rituals, of sacrifices made to appease the house, and of the power that would be granted to those who completed the rites. They mentioned a circle and a covenant, terms that sent a jolt of fear through her. Whoever had written these letters had been involved in something far more terrifying than Sarah had imagined. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stuffed the letters back into the box and returned it to the shelf. She needed to get out of there, needed to find Mark and tell him everything she had discovered. But as she turned toward the door, she heard a sound that froze her in place, a soft, deliberate creak, as if someone had just stepped into the room. Slowly, Sarah turned around, her eyes scanning the shadows. The room was empty, but she could feel a presence, something watching her from just beyond the reach of the lamplight. She took a step back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air around her seemed to thicken, the shadows pressing in on all sides. And then she saw it, a figure barely discernible in the darkness, standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, gaunt, with eyes that gleamed like distant stars. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as the figure took a step forward, the sound of its movements muffled by the thick carpet. It said nothing, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Unable to move, unable to scream, Sarah could only watch as the figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and skeletal. It pointed toward the door, and though its face was hidden in shadow, Sarah knew it was staring directly at her. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanishing into the shadows, as if it had never been there at all. The room was silent once more, but the sense of dread remained, an oppressive weight that bore down on Sarah's chest. She fled the room, not daring to look back, the echo of her footsteps chasing her down the corridor. The mansion seemed to shift and groan around her, the walls closing in as she ran. She didn't stop until she reached the door to her bedroom, slamming it shut behind her and locking it tight. For a long time, Sarah stood there, her back pressed against the door, her body trembling with fear. The journal, the letters, the figure in the shadows, everything pointed to a dark and terrible truth, one that she was only beginning to understand. And as she lay in bed that night, the covers pulled up to her chin, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching her, lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness, waiting. The house was full of secrets, and Sarah knew that whatever was hidden within its walls was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy drapes, casting long, muted shadows across the bedroom. Sarah had barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the window, sent her heart racing. The terror of what she had discovered in the East Wing lingered in her mind, an insidious presence that refused to be shaken. Mark had already left for the office when she finally dragged herself out of bed. He'd been distant lately, dismissive of her concerns, and his reassurance that everything was perfectly fine only served to deepen her anxiety. The mansion, with its oppressive silence and dark history, had begun to feel more like a prison than a home. She spent the morning wandering the mansion aimlessly, her mind consumed by the revelations from Margaret Blackwood's journal. The words seemed to echo in her thoughts, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. The house demands a sacrifice. But it wasn't just the journal that haunted her. It was the figure she'd seen in the shadows, the gaunt, skeletal presence that had pointed her toward the door, as if urging her to leave, or warning her to stay away from something even worse. Whether it was a ghost, a hallucination, or something else entirely, she couldn't say. But she knew she wasn't safe. Not here. Not with Evelyn. Evelyn. The woman was an enigma, her icy demeanor hiding secrets that Sarah was only beginning to uncover. The more Sarah thought about it, the more convinced she became that Evelyn knew far more than she let on. Mark's mother was at the center of this web of darkness, and Sarah was determined to find out how deep it ran. As the day wore on, the mansion's oppressive atmosphere seemed to tighten its grip on her. The shadows in the hallways grew longer, darker, as if the house itself was conspiring against her. The servants continued to move through the rooms like wraiths, their faces blank, their eyes downcast. Sarah felt like she was suffocating, trapped in a house that was slowly driving her mad. By late afternoon, she could take it no longer. She needed answers, needed to confront Evelyn about what she had found in the East Wing. But as she approached the drawing room where Evelyn often spent her afternoons, she heard voices. She paused just outside the door, straining to make out the conversation. "You're losing control, Evelyn," a man's voice said, low and urgent. "She's asking too many questions." It took Sarah a moment to recognize the voice. It was Dr. Whitmore, the family physician who had been attending to Evelyn's supposed illness. He'd been a frequent visitor since Sarah and Mark moved in, but Sarah had always felt there was something off about him, something predatory in the way he watched her. Evelyn's reply was calm, measured. "I am aware, Doctor, but she is of no consequence. The ritual will proceed as planned." Sarah's blood ran cold. The ritual. The same one Margaret Blackwood had written about in her journal, the one that demanded a sacrifice. And now she knew who the intended sacrifice was. Her. "I hope you're right," Dr. Whitmore continued. "We're running out of time. The house, it's growing restless. You know what will happen if we fail." Evelyn's voice hardened. "We will not fail. I have waited too long for this. She will fulfill her role, just as the others did." The others. Sarah's mind raced back to the photo album she had found in the attic, filled with pictures of Mark's previous wives, all of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. They hadn't just been unfortunate accidents. They had been sacrifices, part of some twisted ritual that Evelyn and Dr. Whitmore were now planning to repeat, with her as the next victim. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled back from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. She needed to get out of here, needed to find Mark and convince him of the danger they were in. But as she turned to flee, the door creaked open, and Evelyn stepped out, her cold eyes locking onto Sarah's. "Eavesdropping, my dear." Evelyn's voice was a velvet trap, smooth and dangerous. "That's a very bad habit, you know." Sarah tried to mask her fear, but she knew Evelyn could see right through her. I was looking for Mark, she lied, taking a step back. I thought he might be in here. Mark is at work, as you well know, Evelyn said, her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But don't worry, you'll see him soon enough. Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She needed to get out of this conversation, needed to buy herself time to think. I'll be in the garden then, she said, turning on her heel and hurrying away before Evelyn could say anything more. She fled through the hallways, the walls seeming to close in on her with every step. The mansion was a maze, a labyrinth of secrets and lies, and she was trapped in the heart of it. As she reached the back door, she caught sight of the garden through the window. The hedges and flower beds were perfectly manicured, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling in her mind. She pushed the door open and stepped outside, the cool air hitting her like a slap in the face. She needed to calm down, needed to think rationally if she was going to survive this. But even as she tried to collect her thoughts, the enormity of what she had overheard crashed down on her. Evelyn and Dr. Whitmore were planning to kill her. Not just kill her, sacrifice her as part of some ancient malevolent ritual tied to the house. And Mark? What about Mark? Did he know? Was he complicit in this? Or was he just as much a pawn in Evelyn's game as she was? Her thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound, and she looked up to see one of the gardeners pruning the rose bushes near the hedge. He glanced up at her briefly, his expression unreadable, before returning to his work. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something, pity, fear. Sarah's heart sank. The staff, they knew. They had known all along. That's why they avoided her, why they refused to speak to her about the mansion's history. They were afraid. Afraid of Evelyn, afraid of the house, afraid of what would happen if they stepped out of line. A sudden thought struck her, and she hurried over to the gardener, her pulse racing. "Please," she whispered urgently. "You have to help me. I need to get out of here. They're going to—" "Mrs. Blackwood," the gardener interrupted, his voice low and firm. "I can't help you. None of us can. The house, it won't let us. It won't let you." "What do you mean?" she demanded, desperation creeping into her voice. "What is this place? What are they planning to do to me?" The gardener's eyes darted around nervously before he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "The house is alive," he said. "It feeds on us, on our fears, our lives. We're all trapped here, you, me, everyone. And once it has you, it never lets go." Sarah felt a cold dread settle over her. "But there must be a way out," she insisted. "There has to be." The gardener shook his head slowly. "There's only one way out, Mrs. Blackwood, and it's not a path you want to take." Before she could ask what he meant, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps. The gardener straightened up and quickly returned to his work, his expression once again a mask of indifference. Sarah turned to see Evelyn standing at the edge of the garden, watching her with those cold, calculating eyes. "Enjoying the garden, Sarah?" Evelyn asked, her voice as smooth as silk. Sarah forced a smile, her mind racing. "Yes, it's lovely," she replied, though the words felt hollow. Evelyn smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Good. It's important to find peace in such a turbulent time. There was something in the way she said those words that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She had to get away from this woman, away from this house. But where could she go, and how could she escape when everyone around her was either in on the plan or too terrified to help? That night, as she lay in bed, Sarah's mind churned with plans and possibilities. She needed to get Mark on her side, needed to convince him of the danger they were in. But how? Evelyn's influence over him was strong, stronger than Sarah had realized. She couldn't just tell him what she had overheard. He would never believe her, not without proof. But proof was exactly what she had. Margaret's journal, the letters, the figure in the shadows. If she could show Mark the evidence, if she could make him see the truth, then maybe, just maybe, they could escape this nightmare together. The hours ticked by, each one dragging Sarah deeper into her despair. The mansion was silent, the kind of silence that suffocates. And yet, in that silence, Sarah could almost hear it, the soft, steady breathing of the house itself, waiting, watching, hungering. The house was alive and it wanted her. As the clock struck midnight, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't wait any longer. Tomorrow she would confront Mark, would show him everything and plead with him to believe her. She would make him see what she had seen, feel the terror that now consumed her. But deep down, in the darkest corners of her mind, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late, that the house had already claimed her, just as it had claimed the others before her. And as she finally drifted off to sleep, the darkness closed in around her, suffocating, relentless, inescapable. The night was black and endless, a void that swallowed the moon and stars, leaving the mansion in a suffocating shroud of darkness. The wind howled through the ancient trees, rattling the windows as if the very elements were conspiring to keep Sarah inside. But she was no longer afraid of the night or the mansion's whispers. She was afraid of the woman waiting for her below. Sarah stood at the top of the grand staircase, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the walls almost seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they too were waiting for what was to come. Mark was gone, taken by Evelyn to some unknown part of the house, his fate uncertain. But Sarah knew she couldn't wait any longer. The time for confrontation had come, and it was now or never. She gripped the cold banister, her knuckles white, and descended the stairs, each step heavy with the gravity of what she was about to do. The darkness below seemed to thicken with each step, but Sarah kept moving, her resolve hardening with every beat of her heart. The journal, the letters, the revelations, they had all led her to this moment. At the bottom of the stairs, the mansion opened up into the vast, cavernous foyer. The grand chandelier above cast long, eerie shadows across the marble floor, and the air was thick with the scent of old wood and something more sinister. A single candle flickered on a small table by the entrance, its flame barely holding against the oppressive gloom. Evelyn was waiting for her. She stood by the door to the east wing, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were merely waiting for a guest. But her eyes, those cold, piercing eyes, betrayed the truth. They were alive with a dark, unnatural light, filled with a power that seemed to draw from the very heart of the mansion itself. She was calm, almost serene, but Sarah could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. "You finally decided to join me," Evelyn said, her voice as smooth as ever, but now it was laced with an unmistakable menace. "I was beginning to think you would cower in your room all night." Sarah forced herself to meet Evelyn's gaze, her own fear mingled with anger and determination. "Where's Mark?" she demanded, her voice trembling but strong. Evelyn smiled, a cruel, knowing smile that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Mark is where he needs to be, Sarah. He has accepted his place in all of this, as you will soon accept yours." "I'll never accept this," Sarah hissed. "I know what you've done. I know what you are." "And what is that exactly?" Evelyn asked, her tone mocking. "A mother protecting her family? A woman ensuring the survival of her legacy? Or perhaps you think I'm a monster, Sarah? Is that what you see when you look at me?" Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I see a murderer," she spat. "You killed those women, Mark's wives. You sacrificed them to this thing that lives in this house, and now you want to do the same to me." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "You misunderstand, my dear. They were necessary. The house demands a sacrifice, yes, but it is not murder. It is a ritual as old as this land, as old as the stones that built this mansion. And you..." She took a step closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "You should feel honored to be a part of it." Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't back down. "You're insane," she whispered. "This house, it's corrupted you. It's feeding off you, and you're too blind to see it." Evelyn's laughter was soft and cold, echoing off the walls like a death knell. "Blind? Oh, Sarah, I see more clearly than I ever have. The house has given me everything: power, longevity, control. It has sustained me for generations, and now it will sustain me once more." Sarah could feel the ground shifting beneath her, the darkness pressing in closer. "What do you mean?" she asked, dread coiling in her stomach. Evelyn's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with something unnatural, something that sent a bolt of terror through Sarah's core. "The ritual, Sarah. It is nearly complete. But there is one last step." In one swift motion, Evelyn raised her hand, and the door to the east wing swung open with a deafening crash. The force of it sent a gust of wind through the foyer, extinguishing the candle and plunging the room into near-total darkness. But through the doorway, Sarah could see a faint, eerie glow emanating from the depths of the east wing. "You will join me," Evelyn said, her voice low and commanding. "You will fulfill your role, and this house will claim you as it has claimed the others." But Sarah wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the figure that had appeared in the doorway. Mark. He stood just beyond the threshold, his face pale, his eyes blank. He moved as if in a trance, his steps slow and mechanical, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. "Mark!" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. She started toward him, but Evelyn grabbed her arm, her grip like iron. "He cannot hear you, Sarah," Evelyn said, her voice cold and unyielding. "He is part of the ritual now. He belongs to the house." Sarah struggled against Evelyn's grasp, but it was no use. "Let him go," she screamed, desperation clawing at her throat. "Let us both go." But Evelyn only tightened her grip, her expression darkening. "It is too late for that," she said. "The house has chosen you, Sarah. You cannot escape your fate." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked into Mark's vacant eyes. She could feel the darkness closing in around her, the walls of the mansion seeming to pulse with malevolent energy. The house was alive, feeding off their fear, their pain, their very souls. But then, something inside Sarah snapped. A surge of defiance, of anger flooded through her, and she jerked her arm free from Evelyn's grasp. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I won't let this happen. I won't let you take him. I won't let you take me." Evelyn's eyes flashed with fury, and for a moment Sarah thought she saw a flicker of fear in them. "You foolish girl," Evelyn hissed. "You cannot defy the house. You cannot defy me." But Sarah didn't back down. "Watch me," she said, her voice strong and clear. Before Evelyn could react, Sarah turned and ran toward Mark, her heart pounding in her ears. She grabbed his hand, pulling him back from the doorway, away from the eerie glow of the east wing. "Mark, please," she whispered urgently, shaking him. "You have to wake up. You have to fight this." For a moment, Mark didn't respond. His eyes remained unfocused, his body limp. But then, slowly, he blinked, and his gaze seemed to clear. "Sarah?" he murmured, his voice weak and confused. "Yes, it's me," Sarah said, tears of relief springing to her eyes. "We have to get out of here, Mark. We have to leave now." But as she tried to pull him toward the front door, Evelyn's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "Stop them." The shadows in the room seemed to shift, and suddenly the servants appeared, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They moved like specters, closing in on Sarah and Mark, their hands outstretched to stop them. "Run!" Sarah shouted, pulling Mark with her as they sprinted toward the door. But the servants were fast, their movements eerily synchronized, as if they were one entity. They blocked the exit, forcing Sarah and Mark to retreat. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes blazing with an unholy light. "You cannot escape, Sarah," she said, her voice echoing with a power that made the very walls tremble. "The house demands its sacrifice, and it will have you." Sarah's mind raced, her eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. And then she saw it. The chandelier. It hung low just above Evelyn's head, its crystal pendants glinting in the dim light. An idea formed in her mind, desperate and dangerous, but it was their only chance. "Mark," she whispered urgently, "when I say now, you run to the front door. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run." Mark nodded, his eyes wide with fear but filled with determination. Sarah turned her gaze back to Evelyn, who was advancing on them, her face twisted with rage. "Now!" Sarah shouted. Mark bolted for the door, and in the same moment, Sarah grabbed the candelabra from the table and hurled it at the chandelier's chain with all her strength. The metal struck true, and with a loud snap, the chain broke, sending the chandelier crashing down. Evelyn barely had time to react before the chandelier fell on her, the crystals shattering around her like a storm of glass. She screamed, a sound that reverberated through the house, a scream of pure, unadulterated fury and pain. The sound seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion, as if the house itself was crying out in agony. Sarah didn't wait to see what happened next. She ran after Mark, her heart pounding as the walls of the mansion seemed to close in around her. The house groaned, its once solid structure now shuddering, cracking, as if it was coming apart at the seams. The servants were nowhere to be seen, and Evelyn's screams had faded into a low, menacing rumble that echoed through the corridors. Sarah reached the front door and threw it open. Cold night air rushed in, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. Mark was just ahead of her, his eyes wild with fear and confusion, but alive. He was alive, and they were almost free. But as they stepped outside, Sarah felt a pull, a force dragging her back into the house. She stumbled, nearly falling to her knees, but Mark was there, grabbing her arm, pulling her forward. "Don't stop!" he shouted, his voice desperate. "Keep going!" Sarah pushed herself to her feet, fighting against the invisible force that seemed determined to keep her within the mansion's grasp. The house was collapsing behind them, the walls buckling, the roof caving in, as if the very soul of the house was unraveling. They reached the edge of the property, the air thick with dust and debris, the ground shaking beneath them. Sarah glanced back once, just in time to see the mansion give one final, violent shudder before it collapsed entirely, a cloud of dust and rubble rising into the night sky. The house was gone. The nightmare was over. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps, tears streaming down her face. Mark was beside her, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. "It's over," he whispered, his voice trembling. "We're safe. It's over." But as Sarah closed her eyes, relief washing over her, a single thought pierced the haze of exhaustion and fear. Was it really over? In the distance, beyond the ruins of the mansion, a faint, eerie glow flickered in the darkness, like a dying ember refusing to be extinguished. The house was gone, but something, some part of it, remained. And as Sarah stared into the night, the cold wind biting at her skin, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had not yet released its grip on them. The house had demanded its sacrifice, and though it had been denied, the shadows lingered, waiting, watching. The end was only the beginning.